Hello, my name is Sandra Kully. I was born in Grand Island, Nebraska on July 12th, 1937. I grew up there and lived there until I graduated from high school and went to college, and really never lived there after that. I now live in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm married to Kenneth Freed from Omaha, and we have two children, a daughter, Stacy, who lives in Baltimore, and a son, Jeffrey, who lives in Boston. My parents are from Nebraska. Their parents, their mothers were Midwestern. To start out, my mother's mother was Flora Gretz, and then later Greenberger. She was born in Omaha. My mother's father was Max Greenberger. He came to the United States from Pest in the early 1900s, and then he went back because he was from an extremely kosher family. They were kosher bakers. He had a large family in Pest, and he didn't like what he found in New York, I guess. But he came back later, and he brought with him a brother, Sam, and a sister, Anna, who may have been married at the time, and brought her husband as well. And they went to Grand Island, of all non-kosher places, but that's where they lived. Max was a tailor by trade, and he was a tailor in Grand Island for some years, and I can remember my mother pointing out the little shop where he worked. Then when men's ready-made suits became the fashion, he opened a men's clothing store and eventually moved it to a larger building, and it became Greenberger's Clothing Store, which for many years was the largest men's clothing store outside of Omaha and Lincoln, and attracted a following from all over Nebraska, western Nebraska. It has closed. My brother Michael Kully ran the store for some years, and then he retired because of health, but the store still. My father's father was Lou Kully, shortened from Kulikowski. I don't know where he was born, somewhere in Eastern Europe, and I don't know when he came to the United States. My father's mother was Celia Kaplan Kully, and she was born in South Dakota. And when she and her siblings were young, they moved south to Omaha because the weather would be warmer. And that's where she grew up, in South Omaha. She met her husband, Lou Kully, in Omaha. How they got tastings, I don't know, but my father was born in, he said, Fairbury, and then lived most of his life in Hastings. And when he and my mother married, they lived in McCook, Nebraska for a short time, and then moved to Grand Island. His father had a hide and fur business, and then what we commonly called a junk business, a junkyard, as did a number of my uncles. In fact, when I was a little girl, I thought all Jewish men, except my father and a couple others I knew, ran junkyards, because that was all I knew in my family. In addition to having family in Hastings, and I still have family in Hastings, we had family in North Platte. My mother's sister was named Estelle Kaplan Lustgarten, and she lived for many years in North Platte. Her husband was Lou Lustgarten, and you know what he did? He had a scrapyard. She had several children, and one is still alive and lives in Kansas City, and his name is Avram Lustgarten. There were a pretty good-sized handful of Jews in Grand Island and Hastings when I was a kid during World War II. And at the YWCA, which was upstairs over some stores, there would be occasional Shabbos services, and every year high holiday services. They had a Torah scrolls, small ones, and they had a shofar. my father used to blow the shofar, as did Isidore Kahn, who lived in Grand Island at that time, and I suspect Mr. Kaufman, David Kaufman, I'm not sure, I don't remember. One reason that the community was large was that there were a number of businessmen. Their businesses were fueled by an ordnance plant and an air base, small air base on the edge of Grand Island. When the war ended, the air base eventually closed, the ordnance plant closed. And then several of the families moved to California. But only those few families sort of decimated the Jewish community in Grand Island. I remember my parents being very disappointed because those were their friends. They're very good friends. And they said, move to California with us. It's a new life out there. We're going to make a new life. And my dad said, no, he had a business in Grand Island and he couldn't leave, and that was it. But during the war, the Jewish community was quite active. Sometimes people from Kearney and York and Columbus also joined in. There was a Hadassah chapter, B'nai B'rith. We had Hanukkah parties, and I don't remember what we did for Pesach because we always had dinner at my grandma's house in Hastings. But I know that somebody would either go to Omaha to get matzah and other supplies, and at that time there wasn't much else but matzah, or it would be sent on the bus, and then it would be picked up at the bus depot. Of course, growing up in Grand Island, keeping kosher was not easy. My parents did not keep kosher. However, one of my mother's cousins' families did keep kosher, and they either went to Lincoln or Omaha to get kosher meat, or sometimes it was sent in frozen on the bus in a box of dry ice as well. I think growing up in Grand Island was no different. Growing up in Grand Island Jewish was no different from growing up in any small town anywhere in this country Jewish, because stories I have read always say the same thing. There's just a certain amount of being different. Of course, there's a certain amount of being called a dirty Jew, and you have a big nose, and why don't you have Christmas, and all of that sort of thing. We got that as kids, not too much, and of course, my parents heard it as well, and they would always just say, you don't say anything at all. You don't have to call people names. You don't say anything at all. When we were growing up, my brother and I had an experience that, according to a friend in Omaha, was the same as some of her children had. And that is when I was, I think, in the 3rd grade, because my teachers wanted to include my brother, who was in probably the 1st grade, and me in Christmas events, they asked me to be the Virgin Mary in a school play, and my brother, who was small for his age, to be the baby Jesus. Well, my parents thought about this for quite a while. They finally agreed, and so we did. And there were no repercussions, and we all lived happily ever after. When I grew up, of course, in those days, there was a school prayer in the mornings. And my parents gave me the advice that everyone else would get. When everybody else prays to Jesus, you don't say the word Jesus. You just go ahead and pray to God. In those days also, the teachers frequently read stories from the Bible. And so I had a book of children's stories from the Old Testament that I brought to school every year, for several years. I know in the 1st grade and the 2nd grade at least. But my teachers never read from that book. And I couldn't understand why. And I would ask, and they would say, well, we'll read from it. I think one teacher may have read one story once. But finally, I got tired of bringing the book, and I didn't bring it anymore. I still have it. It's at my home in I think in those days, the teachers were afraid, didn't understand, and they just didn't know how to deal with the situation. I was the only Jewish girl in my class, always. However, I was not the only Jewish person. There was a boy my age, as luck would have it. His name was David Waldbaum. He had a sister who was my brother's age. I can't remember her name right now. That's terrible. David and I, of course, were not friends, all through grade school and junior high, probably because we were the only two Jewish kids. And so, of course, we couldn't possibly be friends. But in high school, we did become friends. I mean, we didn't date, we were just friends, and we shared common experiences. David's father was Sidney Waldbaum, and he and apparently his family had an egg business in Grand Island. I only knew the business as an egg candling plant. And the family moved to Grand Island in late 1940s, probably 1943. As I remember, David entered school on the very last day. That was a very uncomfortable situation for a little boy in the kindergarten. There were other Jewish families in Grand Island. Isidore Kahn and Faye Kahn lived in Grand Island. I remember them, I think, coming to Grand Island when I was a child. And they had a daughter, Dorothy, who grew up in the Grand Island school system as well. There were other families older than I am, who had children older than I am, and I didn't know them. My mother said when she was a girl, there were enough kids to have a Jewish Sunday school in Grand Island, and they had a teacher whom she referred to as the Rebbe. And she did have some Jewish religious background. My father, who grew up primarily in Hastings, did not have much at all. Although the Hastings community, by the time I was a kid, actually had more Jews than in Grand Island. My father's two brothers, after World War II, opened a scrapyard in Hastings. What else? Cully Iron and Metal, capitalizing on what his father had had before he passed away very early in the war. He has another brother, his youngest brother, who is still living, who lives in California. He not only left Nebraska, but he left the scrap iron business as well. And he has been a university professor for his entire working career. When I grew up, I was always active in school and whatever was going on, clubs, activities, brownies, Girl Scouts. My brother was active in Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. My mother was both a Girl Scout leader and a Cub Scout leader, fortunately not at the same time. My parents were active in various civic organizations. And in fact, my father and his partners, who ran my grandfather's men's clothing business, Greenberger's clothing store, made it a point to attend every civic club luncheon every week. So somebody was always at lunch with somebody else because they felt that was how you did business. My father also believed very strongly in trading with the local community and certainly not buying anything farther away than Hastings or maybe Kearney, because that way those people would come and trade at your business as well. And it seemed to work. When I was in high school, I did have a social life. I dated non-Jewish boys, and my brother dated non-Jewish girls. But when I got to be about a junior, one of my aunts was very concerned about all this, and so, because she had family in Omaha, arranged a date for me in Omaha and arranged for me to go and visit a family in Omaha and stay with them. They were, their daughters were, I think, a little in awe of me, a Jewish person not living in Omaha, living in Nebraska and still being Jewish. And not only that, but dating non-Jewish boys. The girl, the older daughter, who was my age, said to me, "You date non-Jewish boys. Do you touch him?" "Yes." "Do you kiss him?" "Yes." She was so appalled at this. That was my first, strongest experience with prejudice. Even though there was prejudice in Grand Island, I never really felt it that much. My parents told me it existed. I'm sure my father encountered it in business, although he was a successful businessman and successful in civic organizations. My mother the same. But that was truly the experience that hit home. My father was active in the Masons, which also surprised some people. But after all, when you're in Rome, you do what the Romans do. And of course, as everybody can tell you who lives in a smaller town, you adjust to the diaspora. We did not celebrate Christmas, we celebrated Hanukkah. But we always went over to our friend's house on Christmas Day to see what they got for Christmas. And they always came to our house around Hanukkah to see the different presents that we got. And you mean to tell me that you get presents on 8 nights? That was always their comment. My brother, when he was 13, had a bar mitzvah in Grand Island. Isidore Kahn tutored him for a year or so before his bar mitzvah. I attended for a while his classes, and then, because as you can see I talk a lot, I was requested not to attend his tutoring anymore. But my big question at the time was, why can't I have classes too? And why can't girls have a bar mitzvah? Well, Mr. Kahn explained, girls don't do that. And this was in the late 40s, probably early 50s. I was distressed with this situation, but there wasn't anything that I can do about it, so I didn't go to his sessions anymore. My brother and I did not benefit from Jewish Sunday schools, even though there were a handful of children in the area, because there was just never anyone who could do that. My family, after World War II, my family did go to Lincoln, sometimes South Street Temple, and sometimes the Conservative Synagogue, for high holiday services. But we did not go on a regular basis. I would like to talk a little bit about our lives in Grand Island, how we lived and what we did. To go back to my mother, as I said, she grew up in Grand Island. She was active in school, in gymnastics and dance. She and her sister both took dance lessons. Her sister also attended the University of Nebraska. My mother attended what was called comptometer school, and that's all I know. But a comptometer was a bookkeeping machine, a very large machine, which I'm sure you can hold in your hand now in the form of a computer, but in those days, that's what she did. She and my father were introduced by a friend from Hastings. There were not too many eligible people in their circle, but there were enough. Her sister married a man from Omaha, a Jewish man from Omaha. And as I said, they started out life in McCook and then very quickly moved to Grand Island. My grandfather took my father into his business, the clothing store. My father knew nothing about men's clothing because he had worked for his dad in the hide and fur business, as well as scrap iron. But because his father's business that they had set up in McCook was washed out in a flood, and because my mother was pregnant with an older sibling who did not survive, they came to Grand Island, and her father employed my dad. My dad told a story about the first time he ever sold a shirt to a customer. He said to me, it only happened once. He sold a white shirt to a woman. he absolutely guaranteed it would not shrink and it would not fade. But he said he never said that again. As I said, my parents were active in a number of civic organizations, as were my brother and myself. When I was a little girl, I went to Brownies, sold Girl Scout cookies like every other kid, sold Girl Scout cookies all through high school as well. Was active in Job's Daughters, which is Masonic offshoot for kids. My mother was a member of Eastern Star, another Masonic organization, and my brother was a member of D. Malay, another Masonic organization. I was active in various clubs throughout junior high and high school. I guess because I always had my mouth open and my hand up. I was president of some of those organizations. Sometimes I went to church services as part of Brownies, Girl Scouts. And I remember one time I even went to the Catholic Church. And my parents allowed that because it was part of the group, and their advice always was, when everybody else prays, you don't have to do that. My brother took part in Cub Scout and Boy Scout activities as well, and other activities. I was not in Grand Island for most of his high school education, however, because I was already at the University of Nebraska, where I majored in English and minored in French and journalism. In Grand Island, being Jewish, as I said, was being different. You were always conscious that you were different. You were always conscious that you didn't look like everybody else. Lots of blondes in Grand Island. With the exception of the small Mexican population that has lived in Grand Island for many, many years and has exploded in recent years. But when I was in grade school particularly, my skin was a strong olive color, and I was frequently mistaken for a Mexican. I had a friend who was about my size, and she, of course, had dark hair, and the teachers frequently confused us, even in high school, called us, by each other's names. We didn't mind because we were friends, but because I was still fairly dark-skinned, a lot of teachers thought that I was Mexican. In Grand Island also, my friends told me later, after high school, that they had some pride in having a Jewish friend. I know it had an influence on two of my very good friends. One lives in Lincoln and is active in interfaith organizations, and she sometimes finds herself going to the synagogue or the temple. And she said that came from knowing me and being a friend. So there is something to be said for integration, even if you have to be the one to do it. When I was in junior high school, ninth grade was still a part of the junior high school, and so, of course, we had a graduation ceremony and a graduation party, and we all went. Of course, I had a date with a non-Jewish boy, of course. All through high school, there, as I mentioned, the dating situation, and I graduated from Grand Island High School with everyone else. I don't remember my rank in high school. My grades were pretty good, A's and B's. A number of my friends and I went to the University of Nebraska. At that time, there was one Jewish sorority. This was in 1955, and two Jewish fraternities, Sigma Alpha Mu and Zeta Beta Tau. The Jewish sorority did not, and since I was Jewish, I did not participate in rush activities either because the non-Jewish sororities didn't pledge Jewish girls. But the Jewish sorority participated in Rush Week, and when I was a freshman, they had a particularly large class. I think there were 25 girls in my class, at least 20. And of course, we were all pledged at Sigma Delta Tau, and I was active in the sorority. Once again, I was the president of my pledge class and later became president of the sorority several times. A number of girls that were pledged did not continue, so from my class. They dropped out, got married. During the years that I was in school, the sorority population declined considerably. And some years after I graduated from the University of Nebraska, Sigma Delta Tau closed. But the Sammy House and the Zeeb House did stay active. At the University of Nebraska, I was active because I never could seem to keep my hand down or my mouth shut. And I was in the Panhellenic organization representing Sigma Delta Tau, and I was president of several organizations. And in the spring of 1955, I was crowned May Queen, which was sounds very quaint now, kind of old-fashioned, but in those days it was a fairly big deal. It was not akin to innocents or mortarboards, but it was along those lines. It was a hand-me-down, I guess, ceremony from many years before, where girls were tagged, I don't remember the ceremony, to be in the May Queen's court, and a May Queen was crowned with, as I recall, a crown of flowers, and even though it rained that day, we did it inside. After I graduated from school, I worked in journalism for a few years. My husband continued in school, in law school, and also a master's program in history. And then we moved out of Nebraska to pursue his education further and then a further career. My family has always remained in Grand Island, however, and Hastings. And I always come back every year to visit. People are still always shocked to hear that there are Jews, even today, in Nebraska. My husband and I met in Omaha the summer before our freshman year. I happened to see him on a bus. I was riding home with a friend, and I nudged her to please introduce me to this really cute boy, and she did. He thought the whole thing was just ridiculous, of course. When we were freshmen, his roommate at the Sammy House and my roommate in the dorm were steadies. They had dated all through high school, and they later married. And so, of course, they fixed us up. And after the first few weeks of college, we became a steady item as well. And we have been together ever since, 46 years.
Tell me a little bit about your children.
Our children grew up in several different cities because my husband was a journalist, worked for the Associated Press, and then the Los Angeles Times. They lived in West Virginia and in New York City, and then we settled in Washington, D.C. area for their upper grade school and junior high and high school years. They went to ordinary grade schools and high schools. Because we lived in a semi-rural area, they had a minimum contact with other Jewish kids as well. If we lived in that area today, they would not only have contact with a lot of Jewish kids, but would probably go to a new synagogue that is being built on what used to be farmland in Upper Montgomery County, Maryland. But in those days, they did not have much contact with other Jewish kids. They, however, never felt, I don't think as outsiders, they never talked about it much. They always had friends, were active in school, and went on to college. Our daughter is not married. She lives, as I said, in Baltimore, Maryland, where she has worked for 20-some years in urban planning, urban renewal. She still does. Our son lives in Boston, is married to a non-Jewish woman, and has one child. He works, he has always worked in computers, he was attracted to his job by the fact that it was with computers, and those were new to him in those days, but it started out as captioning. And he worked for some years for the Center for Captioning in Boston, that is housed at WGBH. And he still works in that area, but he now works with computer programs for people who are handicapped visually or hear audibly.
I want to hear about your grandchild.
We have a little grandchild after many years of not having any. She's going to be 2 very soon. And she's a playmate, occasional playmate of the grandchild of Helen and Tuffy Epstein. Their daughter also lives in the Boston area, and they get together from time to time. Well, their grandson is a little older than she is. She's a typical, not quite 2-year-old. And of course, we just think she's wonderful.
What specifically kind of work did your husband do?
My husband has always been a journalist. His ambition was to be a history teacher. And to that end, he went to law school to please his mother. She thought it was a good background. And then he did get his master's degree in history. And we moved to Oklahoma because he wanted to study for a PhD under a certain professor at the University of Oklahoma. Unfortunately, the man died when we got there. But he continued anyway. He did not get his PhD in history, however, because by that time we had 2 young children. I was a teacher earning no more than $5,000 a year, which wasn't a living wage even then. And he had to temporarily, he thought, abandon his plans for a PhD. So he went looking for a job in Oklahoma City. And he couldn't find one because everybody knew he was a student and they wouldn't hire somebody for the summer. And so because I had been active in journalism, I said, well, why don't you try the news wires? And he did, and he was immediately hired by the Associated Press because he's a natural writer. We were sent to Charleston, West Virginia for his first job. At that point, I had moved out of Oklahoma and I was waiting with our 2 little kids in Grand Island for him to resettle. However, he thought we were going to move to Charleston, South Carolina. And it was only through the kindness of another person at the Associated Press that the night before, with his car packed up, he realized, no, we were going to Charleston, West Virginia. And that's where we lived for several years. He was then transferred to New York City, where we lived on Staten Island. And he was then transferred to Washington, D.C., where we lived in Washington and outside of Washington, as I said. We stayed in the Washington area until our children graduated from high school. Our daughter went to school at Goucher College, which is in Maryland. Our son came back to Nebraska. He loved Nebraska. He loved to visit his grandparents in Grand Island and family in Omaha. And so he went to the University of Nebraska for 4 years, an English major. Not the best place for an English major, but that's where he wanted to be, and he enjoyed it. In the meantime, we lived in Argentina, where my husband ran the Buenos Aires bureau, and we were sent from there to Canada. And he later went to Central America, and we lived in Miami for that. And through his work, he also has worked in the Middle East, a lot in the Middle East. When we lived in Washington, he covered a lot of activity in the Middle East, covering the State Department and occasionally the President. And so we have lived briefly in the Middle East. We lived in Beirut, a Jewish couple living in Beirut. Not only were we Americans, but we were Jewish. Nobody seemed to care. We didn't flaunt the fact that we were Jewish because at that time Israel was still in southern Lebanon. But the people who did know didn't seem to care at all. After I came back to Baltimore, I think we were living in we were living in Omaha at the time. My husband remained in Beirut, Lebanon, to work for a while, and then, because I was not there, he began to make friends with the rest of the Jewish community. He didn't want to reach out when I was there because he's always felt it was important to keep me out of any danger that might result from his work, and he was occasionally in really tight spots. But he made friends with the Jewish community. He walked into an office that boldly had in big gold letters on the big window, Mizrahi. And he figured, well, this man must be Jewish. And he walked in and introduced himself, and he asked how big the Jewish community was in Beirut, Lebanon. And the man said, are you staying here now? And my husband said, yes. And then the man said, 61. They invited him for Seder. At the Seder, it was a very eclectic Seder, my husband said. There were some members of this man's family who were still Jewish. There were some of their relatives who were Muslims, some Muslim friends, Christians, and the American ambassador to Lebanon who brought the matzah, kosher, from the United States. I've always been sorry that I missed that Seder. The Jewish community in Grand Island and Hastings were all businessmen of one sort or another. As I said, my father ran a men's clothing store. Another family, my mother's cousin, worked in a clothing store run by Morris Shapiro, Gwen Shapiro Pred's father. And later, he owned 2 women's stores. Wallback's department store, which was one of the largest stores in Grand Island, certainly, was founded by Jews who later converted to Christianity. Between Wallback's and my dad's store, a very large business run by Sidney Walbaum in the egg processing business, those were some of the largest businesses in Grand Island, and they were all Jewish-owned. Other businesses that were Jewish-owned were an auto parts business. The person who ran that later went to California, but someone else came in and ran it. Used car lot. And there were Jewish lawyers, several Jewish lawyers. And there is still one Jewish lawyer living in Grand Island, James Schamberg and his family. In Hastings, it was similar. A large men's store was owned by a man who had been Jewish at one time. There were several other families that ran women's clothing stores, Jewish families. And then my uncles owned a large scrap iron yard. And it is still active, and it is now a very large scrap iron and still sells new steel as well. There are small Jewish cemeteries in both Hastings and Grand Island. An uncle and aunt are Kully are buried in Hastings, as well as one of my grandparents, I think my grandmother. The other grandparent is buried in Omaha. In Grand Island, the Jewish cemetery is larger, and unfortunately, it's nearly all my family. Many of the gravestones have the name Greenberger on them. My grandparents are buried there. An uncle and aunt, Sam and Bessie, are buried there. I believe one of their sons is buried there, Bernard Greenberger. I believe my mother's first child is buried there. Another child is buried there from a family named Berkowitz, which would have been my great aunt's child. The rest of the cemetery consists of a couple other families, other Jewish families that have lived in Grand Island, but the majority of the graves belong to our family. As I said at the beginning, my experience growing up Jewish in Grand Island was similar to the experience of anybody who has grown up Jewish in any small town in any city in the United States. Perhaps in the South it was a little more difficult. My mother constantly reminded us to remember who we are. She reminded us at Hanukkah, and she reminded us at other holiday times, always remember that you are Jewish. Don't do anything to give us a bad name. That was her way of keeping us in line, I think. But the thrust of it was always remember that you are Jewish. So I tell this long, drawn-out tale to let people know that you can indeed grow up and be who you are anywhere. You can maintain your identity. You don't have to lose it in the crowd. I send this message to my children and my grandchildren in the hopes that it will guide them in their future. Thank you.